With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program. We are, as always, thrilled to have you here with News Radio 1440's Tactics here in the Situation Room. We appreciate you making us a part of your day, and we thank you for your time, as we always try to make sure never to waste it. So let's go ahead and jump straight into the news. As always, we start with our coronavirus update for what's going on right here in the state of Alabama. Now, let's go ahead and look at the latest statistics from the Alabama Department of Public Health. You can see there that there are 5,055 people that have had confirmed cases. Now, since Thursday, that is plus 676. And because they are weekend numbers, that may seem really, really high. But remember, we're taking a conglomeration of 4 days worth of statistics there. And another thing that you might want to understand is that if you're looking per day at how much they've increased, it's really not anything out of the ordinary. And interestingly enough, 113 deaths, which we're going to get into why that's kind of interesting. That hasn't really gone up in a few days. But really the thing that has stuck out about this is that it hasn't stuck out. I know that's a weird thing to say, but if you're looking at the statistics, we've kind of gotten into a sense of normalcy, as it were, in several areas, whether you're looking at confirmed cases, the number of overall testing, deaths, hospitalizations, all of the statistics you're seeing there, weirdly enough, have not really normalized, but they've gotten to where we have enough data to look at about where they've been for the past several days, and really not much has changed in about a week. The numbers continue to increase, sure, but if you're looking at how much they're increasing by, we're not seeing any massive outliers when it comes to things that are you can really point to and show a consistent pattern in a particular place. They've just all kind of come into a sense of normalcy, which is really, really good in a way, because of course if there is a sense of normalcy, it means a lot of weird, unpredictable things are not happening. And it also means that we're not seeing some of the ridiculous levels of spikes and shortages that we were expecting and that a lot of people were predicting. And there's nothing wrong with those predictions. It's not to say anything against them, because, I mean, this thing has been basically impossible to predict. And to know what's coming around the corner is really too much to ask of anybody. But the important thing to really take away from that is to keep in mind that if this is the case, and it is, that we're not seeing some of those insane level of people, freaking out and the hospitals being completely out of supplies and overrun. We haven't seen any of that. And really now the question becomes is, okay, how much of the fact that we're really not seeing that, and it doesn't look like we're going to see that at any time in the future, how much of that was, okay, we've done what we were supposed to do, we need to keep doing essentially what we've been doing, and how much of that is, well, maybe we overblew this thing a little bit? Because that's a fine line to walk, and unfortunately, even though I've been trying to invent this for years, we do not have an alternate reality machine. I mean, being the curious person that I am, I would love to have an alternate reality machine, just essentially be able to look into a screen or a crystal ball or something and be able to see what would have happened if we had done X. But that's not the way the world works. And so, unfortunately, what we're dealing with here is there's a level of uncertainty. To where we can't really know for sure what's going on and what's going to happen in the future. And if we had done the opposite, let's say we took no precautions whatsoever, it's impossible to know what would have happened. What would have happened if Governor Ivey had never issued the stay-at-home orders? Well, we can't know that. That's not a thing that we can know for a fact, and so we just have to deal with the information that we have and make heads or tails of it the best that we can. Let's go ahead and look at the cases, the confirmed cases for the state of Alabama, because there's something interesting I want to point out here. And again, the news is basically that there's not really news. You can see that that's a pretty flat line. You haven't really seen any spikes, and the wider level of data that we get, the less drastic it looks, and that's because we have more data points. And so when you're looking at, if you were to scale this particular chart down to only look at, say the first 3 weeks maybe, well, that graph would look radically different, and it would look like it's a lot more random. The more data we get, the more consistent it looks, which is to say that it doesn't necessarily look like this thing is causing the levels of mass chaos that we originally predicted that it would, which is good. I mean, we've barely passed the 5,000 mark, and that's not great, but that's where we are right now. And it looks as though, even though there was a little bit of a hiccup, there was a little bit of a spike about a week ago, what we're looking at now, it doesn't really look like we're flatlining. It doesn't look like we're plateauing, but it also doesn't look like we're going to see one of those big spikes. I mean, that's just not realistic at this point based on the data that we have so far. It's not impossible. It's not completely out of the question, but it's certainly unlikely at this point. And so we're really neither leveling nor spiking on that one. I actually see a comment from Miss Karen asking for a little more volume. Here's the thing about that. My mic, my mic is fine. My soundboard is actually starting to cut out on me, and I can't actually get it repaired because everything shut down right now. Soundboard repair is not something that is deemed essential by the government, ergo I can't get anybody to take a look at it, even though I'm a member of the media. There's really not anything I can do about that. We're just going to have to do the best that we can with what we've got. My soundboard is going on the fritz. I've mentioned that on the show before. I'm trying to get it fixed, but right now this is the most volume that I can do, unfortunately. All right, let's look at this next graphic. Let's look at graphic number 3. I can go ahead and pull that up. This is the new corona cases. Now, this is the one that I have found the most interesting in all of my coverage of this. This is the one that I've been keeping the closest eye on. And unfortunately, we've seen a handful of times where it looked as though there was going to be a trend. And remember, these are just new cases per day. This is not total cases. That's why you see the bar go up and down as opposed to the last one, which goes up in a straight trajectory. It may go up some days more than others, and this is why. So if you're looking at the new cases here in the state of Alabama per day, you'll notice that there were some big spikes right around April 9th. And then you're seeing it start to go down, and then you saw another big spike, and then you see it going down. The question is this going to be a pattern? Are we going to see a massive jolt of spikes of new cases one day, and then it gradually goes down and resets and then jumps up right again? You could argue based on looking at this chart that that's a pattern, but the thing is we have so few points of reference, so little data, and this is not just for the state of Alabama, this is nationwide and worldwide. We have so little data compared to other things, other diseases, when we're comparing infection rates and that kind of thing, that the data is useful to a point, but it's very limited in what it can tell us. But you'll notice here recently, there haven't been a lot of big spikes like the last big one that we saw on the 15th. It's just kind of going up and down, back and forth over the past 4 days at roughly somewhere between 150 to 200 new cases a day. Now, 150 to 200 new cases a day is certainly not great. It's certainly not a good thing, but that seems to be the only discernible pattern for that particular graph in new cases that we've seen here recently. So if we're leveling, I mean, granted, that chart has been way too erratic to tell, and we could see a major spike tomorrow that breaks the records and completely changes the trajectory that we're on. That is a real possibility. That's what we're living out here in real time. But here's the thing. It can't be even though it looks like it's starting to level off now a little bit, and that seems to be the trend, at least here recently, especially with the new cases in Alabama so far, that chart can't even be consistent enough to make educated guesses. And that's one of the things that's very frustrating for me looking at this data, is that it has some consistency over really about the past 4 days. Well, 4 days, even compared to a month worth of data, 4 days is really just not enough data to give you a sense of any consistent pattern or any way to make a projection or a guess on what is going to happen in the near future. And so just based on what I'm looking at right now, I don't see how anybody could look at that data and make a decent prediction. Maybe somebody that has more experience with this, with epidemiology, would be able to do that. But so far, pretty much all the data that we've looked at and all of the predictions that have come out from experts in this field, either on the state of Alabama or the country as a whole, have been way off. And so I think that's what so many people find frustrating right now, is none of the data is consistent enough to even really make an educated guess. No matter how smart you are, no matter how qualified you are, no matter how objective you're trying to be with looking at the data, even if you have no political bias or bias of any other kind at all, the data just is not enough to make a solid educated guess. And that is why it is so incredibly important that we need to look at all the data that we can, gather as much data as possible. But unfortunately, even a lot of the educated guesses are going to come after they're really useful. That's really the frustrating thing about this right now. It can maybe help us with future cases of this virus or a similar virus, but by the time we get enough data to really be able to dig in and try to figure out what all that means and what strategies worked and what didn't, it's going to be more or less too late. By the way, I did want to bring up one point on this, because I've seen a lot of this going around on the internet, and a lot of people are sort of booing Sweden and Sweden's approach to this, which has been, we're not going to force anything to close. We're going to enact some social distancing protocol, but we're not actually going to go after it. We're not going to force businesses and factories and things like that to shut down. And a lot of people have been very angry with Sweden about this. They've been calling them out and saying that what they're doing is dangerous. And a whole bunch of people are really angry and saying that it's proof that Sweden's experiment failed by looking at the fact that they have a higher death rate than most of the other countries, both the U.S., much higher than the U.S. actually, and several of the nations in Europe. Here's the problem with that, though. Sweden's whole strategy was basically not necessarily full steam ahead, but let's not completely halt the economy, not bring it to a dead stop. Let's try to keep the wheels rolling at least a little bit, kind of a rolling stop, like I do at stop signs. Try to get a rolling stop going to where it's paused and it's slowed down, but things are still rolling. And they knew going into that would mean that initially their death count and their death toll was going to be higher. They admitted that. They said that in the initial paper and the initial announcement that they were going to do that. But looking at that right now doesn't do any good, and here's why. If their whole strategy is to keep the normal functions of everyday life rolling, knowing that the death toll is going to be higher for them on the onset, what they are counting on is for it to be roughly the same in the long run. And so what's going on right now doesn't tell us really whether Sweden's approach worked or didn't work, because we're still in the middle of the experiment, as it were. I know you don't like thinking about something as an experiment when you're dealing with people's lives, and I totally understand that sentiment. But at the same time, I'm actually kind of glad that Sweden is doing this, just if nothing else, from the standpoint that we have a control group to measure against. Because considering every other first world country on earth has done the opposite of what Sweden has done, it's actually really good that we have at least one country that decided to do the opposite, just so we have something to compare it to. So that's what's going on in Sweden right now, is that they're basically keeping everything running, and of course they have a higher death toll and a higher infection rate than other countries. They knew that going in. That's the point. The question is, 6 months from now, when we get to take a step back and look at how all these nations handled it as a whole, if Sweden has roughly the same death rate, the same deaths per capita as the United States and the UK and Italy and Spain and Germany and Greece and all those other nations, if we take a step back several months from now and see that, they had about the same amount of deaths per capita and really didn't hurt their economy all that much, well, then that means that Sweden's approach worked. But it's way too early in the game to tell if that actually paid off right now. It's kind of like, to give a football analogy, because football analogies just work in the state of Alabama, to give a football analogy, it would be very similar to how Gus Malzahn decided to take his star running back and basically bench him for the majority of the first half this past football season. And basically say, all right, well, we're going to put Boobie Whitlow in roughly around after halftime because we want him to have a fresh set of legs when that happens, because he's getting too tired during the games and he can't really do much in the second half. So we're going to save him for the second half, hoping that, well, like, Gus Malzahn had to know that in the first half of the football game, that was going to hurt his team. His team was not going to score as many points without Boobie Whitlow being in the game. But he was willing to take that, willing to do that intentionally, knowing that his team was likely to not score as much with Boobie Whitlow sitting on the bench, hoping that they would be able to do better in the second half, and that would make up the difference. And that was a strategic move to try to catch their defense just completely, when they're tired and when Boobie can make a bigger difference in the game, hoping that the overall points that they scored was going to be more if he just held out Boobie until the second half, when their defense was worn down a little bit. Now, granted, that strategy had mixed results, but my point in all of that is it would be impossible to look at the first half of the game score and at halftime say, see, Gus Malzahn's strategy failed. Well, you don't know that yet. You haven't seen the final score. Maybe Sweden's approach is awful. Maybe it winds up being a massive failure. That's a real distinct possibility, but the point is, saying that it's a really bad strategy and saying that you can definitively say now by looking at the numbers that Sweden's approach did not work when we're still at halftime, that's not a good analysis. That's not a good way to look at this data, and it's by no means proof that Sweden's approach didn't work. One more statistic I wanted us to look at really quickly. Let's go ahead and look at this one. This is the deaths in the state of Alabama, since we're talking about death rate anyway. So if you look at the deaths in Alabama, a really strange thing happens. You'll notice that over the past 3 days, we have been at 113 deaths. So effectively, because remember, these things take a little time to report, when we got the numbers from Friday, and there was a substantial spike on Friday, but when we got the numbers from Friday, those numbers stayed pretty much completely they did stay completely stagnant at 113 until today. Now, do you notice that there are, see if you can pick up the pattern here, I'll give you a second. Do you notice, looking at this data, that there are other lulls that look pretty much exactly the same? Because you should notice another one where the death rate remains stagnant, also on April 11th through 13th. You may also notice one, granted it's only 2 days instead of 3, but one where the death toll also stagnated on the 5th and the 6th. You know why? Because those are weekends. Now, this is an incredibly strange statistic, because it would be one thing if the number of new cases stagnated on the weekends. That would be somewhat understandable, because you would assume, okay, the people that are getting out that have to work, that are essential workers, those people are contracting the virus during those work days, and then they're getting tested and the virus is taking course and they're having to go through that process, and on the weekends they don't have to do that. And that's why we're not having new cases on the weekends, or lagging behind by a day. In other words, not having them on Saturday and Sunday and Monday. That's not what is happening, though. We're seeing a lack of deaths on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And by the way, this actually keeps trend with the trends going on nationwide. It's been fascinating to watch, but for whatever reason, people do not die in nearly as great a rates from the coronavirus Monday through Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday as they do Monday through Thursday. It's been really interesting. It's been really fascinating that this is the case because you usually do live for a few days after getting the coronavirus, and so it's just very odd that if you already have it, why would people not be dying during the weekend? It doesn't really make any sense, but that's what we're seeing. I don't really. There's nothing I can use to explain why that's taking place. Maybe the morgues or the guys who perform autopsies. I don't know. Maybe they don't have as much staff on the weekend, and so it's happening at a similar rate, but isn't getting reported. But I find that hard to believe. I don't know. It's really, really strange. Anyway, there is a big story coming out that tells us that the numbers that we're looking at may not even be good numbers. And this is really concerning for a number of reasons. First of all, it means all the reporting that I've been doing for the past several weeks may very well be completely worthless because I was working off of wrong data. So the Alabama Department of Public Health issued a series of tweets the other day that suggest that our numbers of confirmed cases might indeed actually be inflated. So what they did was, and there was a Twitter thread, I think it winds up going on for about 4 or 5 tweets, you can look it up, but they noticed Friday afternoon that an outside agency that had been reporting things for them, it turns out there were a whole bunch of tests that were marked positive when they are in fact negative. So the test actually came back negative, but they were being reported as positive. We don't know the name of the agency. We're not sure exactly how this took place. We do know, and they did offer some clarification here, which should set some people's minds at ease. Even though there were some negatives that were reported as positives, there were no patients that got the wrong result back from their test. So in other words, any Alabamian that got a test result back, now maybe the test isn't all that reliable, so they could get a false negative or a false positive, but if the test showed that you were negative, that's the result you got, and vice versa. So if you're a citizen and you got the result of your test is still correct, but they got reported, many of them, as confirmed cases, and so the implication of this is actually kind of terrifying. Because what it means is, not only is it possible that we have been working off of faulty numbers, and keep in mind, these numbers are significantly less than we originally thought that they were going to be. I mean, we were looking at several tens and tens of thousands of people in the state of Alabama, and thousands upon thousands of deaths, when now we're looking at, 400-ish, which is still scary, but not nearly the apocalypse that we originally thought that it was going to be. And when you're looking at the Alabama Department of Public Health's numbers, if we have a whole bunch of cases that were reported to the Alabama Department of Public Health as positive that turned out to be negative, what happened when those people died? Now, maybe because of the way that they recorded the data, this is not the case, but it could also mean that our number of coronavirus deaths is inflated as well. If we have a whole bunch of people that we thought tested positive for the novel coronavirus and didn't, then that means there are a whole bunch of people that didn't have the Wuhan flu that died that got counted as though that was what killed them. Now, maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. I'm really not sure. And I tend to think that that's probably not the case, because if we're talking about tests that came back negative but were reported as positive, but the individuals all got the correct test results, which is what the Alabama Department of Public Health is currently claiming, then what that means is the individuals, they knew, and it was just when they gathered up all the numbers and tallied them up and reported them on the website that some of the numbers were artificially inflated. So I'm guessing that probably means that the death rate itself is not artificially inflated, although, who knows? I honestly just hope that that is not the case, because we already have a slightly elevated death toll, a slightly elevated fatality rate, it's hovering just under 2%. And so if it turns out that we have more deaths and less confirmed cases than we originally thought, but the number of deaths remains the same, that's going to pump that number up to probably over 2%. And that's not a good place to be. So I'm hoping, because of course if the person died, then it doesn't bring them back to know that they didn't actually have coronavirus. But I'm hoping that the death rate is also artificially inflated, because if not, that means our fatality rate is actually a little higher than we originally thought that it was going to be. So, look, I feel bad for the people, because you know that they're not intentionally screwing this up, or you would think so. I mean, I can't think of a motive they would possibly have for making this mistake. It probably was just human error, and I don't think that we should crucify them for that or anything to that extreme, but it is really disappointing in the middle of an epidemic that these outside sources, these outside reporting labs that they have charged with giving them the numbers to keep it accurate, has been giving out information that is incorrect. I understand why that is something that we've really got to sort out. Now, they did say that they were going to release the correct numbers in case they were giving us an artificially inflated one, but they said they're probably going to take a few days to actually be able to sort that out. So we'll see where that goes. We will update with you. We will update you on that as quickly as we can. But this is just another reason why we need to get as much data as humanly possible. That should really be our goal. That should really be our focus right now. We want to make sure that we are getting as much data as humanly possible so that we can use it to actually help us fight this. Because as long as we have bad intel, as long as we have bad data, then the decisions that we make are going to be made to a certain degree out of ignorance. Now, nobody has perfect knowledge, and so you could argue that every decision we've made has some aspect of ignorance to it. I guess that's technically true, but you know what I'm saying. If we really want to make good decisions, if we really want to stay on top of this thing, we've got to have good data. And this is a time where it is really problematic if we're having to go back and check the numbers that we already had and we thought were good, because that just hinders us from looking at new data and gathering new data and factoring in everything that we need to factor in. There's a myriad of reasons why this is something that is problematic, but hopefully we can get all that sorted out. Hopefully we can get it all fixed. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break here. We're going to come back in just a second, and Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama will be joining us in just a second.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I am out on the town despite the fact that we are currently under a stay-at-home order. That's right, Governor Ivey, I am defying your stay-at-home order, which means I am doing what, Judas Priest?
Breaking the law, breaking the law.
That's right. So, the important thing to understand about this is, technically, unfortunately, I'm actually not breaking the law because I am a member of the media, and there was a specific carve-out for people who are in the media doing something associated with their job, which, as you can plainly see, I currently am. And there was also an exception for people that were going out to get some exercise. There were exceptions for people that were going to grocery stores and their home improvement stores, and they were also giving out exceptions for really pretty much everything, including, this was my favorite part, ones that were going out in order to maintain their daily routine. Well, the funny thing about that is that could be pretty much anything. And even for the people that weren't necessarily going out to do something, even if they were blatantly violating the law and doing something that they knew was frivolous, well, all they would have to do is lie about it. And so I find the whole thing really fascinating that the law that was put forth really doesn't do anything. I mean, at all. And so even though I did complain about the law, I think that it's overly heavy-handed. I think it's government trying to control its citizens' behavior. Ultimately, I do understand the fact and acknowledge that the law doesn't really do very much at all. It doesn't really stop anybody from doing something, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And I think really that comes down to a big government mindset. You see, very often a lot of the regulations that governments put in place that are obtrusive don't really have any way to enforce them in the first place. And so while, yes, of course, it's important that those laws are not on the books, and a normal, typically law-abiding citizen doesn't have to walk on eggshells or look over their shoulder every 10 seconds to make sure that they are in compliance with the law, I think that it's also incredibly important for us to remember that normally these regulations don't wind up doing what they set out to do. And the only person that it actually affects is the honest person, the person that doesn't want to break the law simply because they don't want to break the law. And so it winds up becoming a hindrance and an annoyance primarily to the people that want to obey the law, that want to be good citizens, and want to do the right thing, even among this COVID-19 epidemic. That's who it primarily affects. The people that don't care about the law, that don't care about following the rules, they find a way to skirt around it, and so the law does not become a hindrance to them, but the average law-abiding citizen. If you want my understanding of why I disagree with big government regulation and government trying to involve itself in every little aspect of our life, that's a pretty good summary of my entire political philosophy. Something to think about.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. My next guest is somebody who really needs no introduction. She's somebody that's been on the show a number of times, actually used to have a weekly segment here when the legislature in Alabama was in session, but now she's coming to talk to us about something completely different. Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama. Thank you for being on the program with us today.
Thank you for having me. I miss our weekly chats now that the legislature is quarantined.
Yeah, it's crazy. All of a sudden the apocalypse comes and our elected officials are nowhere to be found. So,
Yep.
But anyway, so I understand that Eagle Forum, Alabama is actually putting together a protest tomorrow to address exactly that.
Well, it is actually not Eagle Forum of Alabama. It is a grassroots organization group, just a loose group called Stand Up Alabama. They've just asked if I would help with that, so I am helping. But it's just a bunch of business owners and grassroots folks who want our state to open up. And we are supporting Friday's recommendations that came down from the task force to reopen Alabama with phase 1. We think those are great. Eagle Forum agrees with those as well and thinks that those protocols that are in place for these businesses to open, there's no reason why we should not start reopening now. So this is a rally in support of that. And it's a car rally, which I've never actually done a car rally before. So this is going to be fun.
I'm guessing this is not something that's happened all that often, not just here, but anywhere else in the country because of the unique circumstances surrounding this one.
Yeah, you know, what it makes me think of is these biker rallies. We've had some really great patriotic biker rallies that have happened, but really most people want to get out and be on their feet and carry their signs, but we're encouraged. It's sort of a 2-part rally. It starts at 1:00 on Tuesday, tomorrow, and we are wanting people there's a driving route at standupalabama.com. We also have a Facebook page called Stand Up Alabama. So you can see the driving route just comes up Dexter Avenue and goes around the Capitol, and it's just a big loop that will go around. But so everyone can participate, they can stay healthy and not get exposed to anyone else's germs by staying in their cars. But we do have some people that do want to make a statement. They do want to encourage the governor to reopen. And so we will have a podium and a microphone. We will be practicing social distancing, and we're going to do our best to live stream this. So if you're passionate about this, if you've been put out of work, if you need the government to reopen these small businesses, and we encourage you to just park your car, come say your 2 minutes. That's all you get is 2 minutes, and then get back in your car and keep driving around. But mostly it is a car rally. But there is an opportunity, for those who do want to say something.
And one thing that Becky and I were actually just talking about off the air is we're going to try to stream it on Tactics. So my YouTube page, my Facebook, we're going to try to get a live stream of the event on Tactics. we can't promise that right now because we're still trying to work out the technical details, but we're certainly hoping that that is the case, and we'll try to stream it to as many different locations as you can. And the great thing about that is if you are at the car rally riding around in your car, you'll still be able to hear the stuff that's actually going on at the podium as well. So
That's
be looking for that tomorrow.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I think is going to be so neat about it, is because you can still participate and hear what's happening at the ground level on the sidewalk with these different speakers. But at the same time, you're in the background riding around, honking the horns and making some noise. So it's going to be really fun.
Right, and I'll try to get that on my audio podcast too, so in case somebody doesn't have the data or can't do video, I'll try to get that to where it's an audio-only format live as well. But again, we're working on the technical details of that. Now, one thing that I wanted to ask you, Becky, because I do think that this is an important rally, and like you, I'm very much on board with a lot of the recommendations for reopening Alabama that the lieutenant governor and other members of the task force were talking about the other day. Would you just give our audience an understanding and lay out exactly what are in those guidelines and the reasons that they might want to come out and support it?
So there are four, in phase one, there are four basic areas that are going to open, and I'm going to do my best to do this from memory. But the first one is retail. One of them is close contact services. So that'd be hair salons, nail salons, tanning, and tattoo parlors. Then we have daycare centers. And there was one more, and it's escaping me right now. But these are all open with different protocols. Oh, restaurants was the last one.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
You're able to open up your business, but you have guidelines as, wearing masks. Like, for example, in restaurants, you can't have parties bigger than 6 at a table. And then all the tables are spaced out so that you have that social distancing, at least 6 feet. And when you're with 6 people at the table, they're supposed to be the people that you already live with.
Right.
So, you can go out as a family or whatever.
But if you get a nice Catholic family, they got to get 2 tables. That's what we're saying.
Right. That's exactly right. Okay. And then for other places like hairdressers and those kind of shops, you wait in the parking lot and you get texted when it's your time to come in, and they wash the doors handles in and out. Each person that comes in and out, the room and the seat where they're sitting is scrubbed down, and the people wear masks. And, so there are really reasonable standards to help keep the customers and the employees safe. And there is a great, if people want to read this, they can go to alabamaeagle.org, and we do have that booklet. It's 157 pages of whatever, it explains every business and what they have to do. And anyway, so these are just really sensible things. And Caleb, I'm sure you've heard, especially people who are independent contractors, they're getting turned down for unemployment. And they are hanging by a thread, literally. It's just not fair that the government does not allow them to go to work when they can work and still keep themselves and their customers safe.
Well, and that's the thing. As much as I dislike it when people try to cast some kind of evil connotation with people that work for big corporations like your Home Depots and your Walmarts and your Lowe's and that kind of thing, I think that that's absolutely wrong. But I think we also have to recognize that a lot of the businesses that you just named in the categories that you just talked about, those are primarily our small local businesses that are left out in the cold, where some of the larger big box, big name businesses, they're not having those same limitations. And so I think it's only fair that if one gets to open up, we certainly need to let our smaller businesses, especially our local businesses, open up that way.
Yeah, I agree. And when you look at the amount or the number of small businesses, they do outweigh these box stores, and they're really put at a disadvantage right now.
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to talk to you about too, because one thing that I notice about those recommendations, and we were talking about them a little bit earlier on the program as well, one of the things that I really wanted to look into and to mention is that people seem to have a really difficult time with nuance. They tend to look at the people that are on the furthest edges of this debate. In other words, they kind of only tend to see the people that are saying, no, we have to stay locked up for at least 1.5 years until we develop a vaccine. Or on the other side, no, let's just get rid of all of the regulations right now. Let's all come back and act exactly like we were beforehand. And neither one of those approaches are smart. What you're talking about is yes, let's open it back up, but not all at one time. Let's kind of ease into
Right.
this thing.
Right. And Governor Ainsworth made it very clear on Friday when they spent a lot of time talking with small businesses and coming up with these ideas. And he said, we're really mitigating the risk by allowing these other businesses to open. Instead of having so many people at a box store, we're opening up these other stores so that people can spread out, and go to different stores and not have to all be crammed into one store. And I just think there's balance in this. Like
Sure.
you said, you go from one extreme to the other. But when you look at Alabama's numbers, we only have 113 deaths confirmed from this illness.
Yeah.
And we have 4.8 million people in the state. And there's many parts of the state that aren't hardly affected at all. At least, even if you're going to fight on this phase 1 opening, then let's just do it county by county. Look at the counties. Maybe Birmingham, Jefferson County isn't quite ready to fully implement phase 1, or maybe they need, some stricter guidelines in some of the areas in Jefferson County. But for the most part, we're ready. We have got to go. I don't think people realize the economic impact, which will have a domino effect on health and, all kinds of issues that we deal with in the daily life. They're not going to realize that if we don't open up quickly.
Well, and that's one of the things that I've been saying since the very beginning, and the reason that I opposed Governor Ivey's stay-at-home order that was statewide is because I think that this ultimately, as a small government federalist, I really do think that these kinds of decisions are best left in the hands of local people. It may make a lot of sense for Birmingham to stay closed a little bit longer because they have a high concentration of cases. If you're in Slocum, Alabama, down by the border, and you've only had a couple dozen cases, it kind of makes sense to leave everything open and just tell people to be a little extra cautious. Like, having those different approaches makes a lot of sense, and the people that are closest to those counties are the ones that are in the best position to make those decisions.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's a small government concept right there.
One thing that I was going to ask about, because I've heard reports of this, and I doubt that this is the case with yours, but I'm afraid that this could happen in the near future. I don't know if you heard, but Facebook has actually actively announced that it's shutting down protests for some of these events. I believe the only states it's done that for so far are California, New Jersey, and New York, but they could have, this news is like 8 hours old now, so it could be completely different. And what they're doing is the events that you can do, that you can make on Facebook, those are specifically what they've shut down because they've said the government deemed them dangerous. So have y'all had any issues with that, or?
No, and we created the event last week, and it actually, we're okay. I mean, it's not like we have a whole bunch of people on it yet, but Stand Up Alabama is the Facebook page. But no, I have heard those same things. And, of course, you've heard about, Facebook shutting down vaccine information or anything that, they've just taken it upon themselves that they're the fact checkers. And it wouldn't surprise me. We'll see tomorrow, Caleb, if we're able to stream. I wonder, will they block streams that are happening from these live events?
It very well could be. And the thing that I think is nuts about that is if you're looking at a lot of the things that the media types and sort of the elites on this that are trying to shut down things like this, normally it's things where people are actually being pretty, cautious about it. I think there was one in Michigan the other day where the people that were watching on, I want to say the feed I was watching was MSNBC, they were just aghast that people were protesting. I'm like, they're sitting in their cars and honking their horns. They're not even near one another.
Yeah. And that's what we're hoping to do here is just come and show your support. We want the governor to hear that we support her opening up the government or, opening up businesses.
Right.
And this is not a I hate Governor Ivey kind of protest at all. It is a rally in support of the recommendations that were given. So we want to be happy warriors tomorrow, but it's time. Caleb, do you feel that slippery slope? It started off as a virus and for our health, but now, they're telling us what things are essential and what things aren't. And
I've been fussing about that for about 3 weeks now. So yeah. No, I absolutely feel that because the thing that has bothered me the most out of this whole thing is that the attitudes from a lot of people have essentially been church is non-essential. That's the thing that bothers me the most. They've essentially said, well, I'm sorry, church is just a non-essential function, and regardless of the measures you take with it, regardless of the precautions that you take, you're not allowed to meet. And that seems to have been, it seems as almost though churches were specifically targeted, because you could have a parking lot full of people in a Walmart or in a Home Depot, but you couldn't have 30 people in your local church, even if they were sitting 6 feet apart from one another. And that just blows my mind.
Right. And even, shutting down the sermons in the parking lot.
Right.
That's what was blowing my mind, is that, wow. So it's time, people. It's time to stand up and say, we're ready to open up businesses, and we'll see how this goes. But, we have a voice right now, and we need to use it, because I feel just this little incident of what's happened over the last 6 weeks has really opened my eyes to how lazy and how we just are rolling over at whatever government says. And not that I'm a big, rebel, but we have rights. And I think people have forgotten what those rights are.
Well, and that's the thing, and this is what I've been trying to convey to people that disagree with me on this. The issue is, if the government gets to decide all of a sudden, because a situation is too dangerous, that they can just roll ramshot over any of the rights that they deem are going to be problematic, then we don't have rights.
Exactly.
Like the whole point of an inalienable right given to you by God is that the government isn't allowed to take it away.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Is there anything else you wanted people to know about the protest before we move on?
Well, just want people to come in their cars, bring their flags. You're going to roll down your window. It's going to be a gorgeous day. The driving route is on standupalabama.com or the Facebook page. Share it with your friends. If y'all are just sitting home anyway, it's going to be a gorgeous day. And if you're coming from far away, go home a different route and see some different country while you're out there. Throw the kids in the car. It's going to be a good time. So I just want everyone to come.
Yeah, if nothing else, it's just an excuse to drive around and do something for a little while.
It is. And you know what? It's probably going to be like a huge traffic jam. If we have a lot of people that come, just enjoy it. Just have fun with it. We're all just trying to show our support. And, I hope it's a big log jam. I hope, it's so big that it backs up onto the interstates. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's weird. People probably are getting to the point where they almost miss traffic jams.
Yeah, I know. They miss just driving to work. So this is getting them ready for it to open back up.
Yeah, to give you and the audience an indication of how little I've been driving recently, I've had 2 different families of wasp take up residence inside my truck doors. So.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, definitely need to get that open up for you.
All right. Well, we'll see you there tomorrow, Becky, and we'll try to have that stream available for everybody in the audience. Thank you so much for being with us.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me. Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon. That is Becky Gerritson of Eagle Forum, Alabama. Even though this particular protest is not sponsored by Eagle Forum, Alabama, that's who typically she calls in for, and we do appreciate her hard work and the group Stand Up Alabama that is working on this. We hope to see you there, and we hope to be able to bring you the stream both video through the normal channels, audio through tacticsradio.com. I'm going to look into getting that set up. So we will see you later. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a minute on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible read by Pete Buttigieg. Today's reading is going to come from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 30 through 38. And it says, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who were probably only stealing because the capitalist system had trapped them in a life of poverty. And they stripped him and beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt socially conscious outrage, and came to him and went on a passionate social media rant about how wrong it was that the priest and the Levite had ignored him, and how it proves that traditional organized religion doesn't work. When the man asked him for help, the Samaritan explained how the Jews had been systematically oppressing the Samaritans for centuries, and that he didn't need his help because of his Jew privilege. But despite this, the Samaritan assured him he would be the bigger man and contact his senator in Rome and start a new government program to help victims of roadside robberies and fund it by raising taxes on the 1%. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who taught him to be woke and fought the system with redistribution of wealth instead of just helping that one guy. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same, comrade. Wow. So inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
I feel a lot better. I didn't touch anything, I swear! Oh! Ty, what did you do? It wasn't my fault!
And on today's edition of Breaking the Internet, we've got a couple things that we wanted to bring to you. Excuse me. Just got strangled there for a second there. All right. So on this edition of Breaking the Internet, I did see a meme the other day that asked an interesting question. And one of the reasons that I enjoy reading other ideas, the reason that I follow people that are socialist, communist, that kind of thing, people that see the world differently than me, is because what's so fascinating is they occasionally say something that is profoundly true and either don't realize what they're saying or do realize what they're saying but don't apply it correctly. And this is one of those cases. So this is a meme that went viral the other day. There were a whole bunch of people. Some of my buddies on the left were sharing this over and over again. And so I wanted to just real quickly bring this to your attention. So this was a tweet that went out the other day, and I will censor some of the language. Anyway, it says, nobody learns communism from a book. We're born communist and then get indoctrinated into capitalism. Don't believe me? Go and ask a 7-year-old if we should give homeless people houses, hungry people food, and sick people medicine. Theory later just helps us unlearn and you can guess what the rest of that is. So a couple things that I wanted to bring up on this. First of all, I think it's actually absolutely correct. I think virtually everybody is born fairly liberal. There might be a handful of exceptions. You might be able to find a 5-year-old that just can quote Adam Smith, but as a general rule, when you're looking at kids, you're usually looking at people that if you gave them a list of policy proposals without any prodding or without trying to teach them anything, they probably would just go ahead and default to the more liberal position. Okay, well, this policy would give food to hungry people. Yeah, I'd go off with that. I'd give homes to... wow, I can't talk today. I would give homes to homeless people. Okay, I'd go along with that. That sounds good. Here's the thing that's so funny about that, though. I did the same thing. If you were to ask 3rd grade Caleb, who was 8 years old at the time, because there was an election going on, and that election was taking place between William Clinton and Herbert Walker Bush, do you know who Caleb voted for in our little pretend 3rd grade election? I voted for Bill Clinton. And the reason that I did is because when I looked at the policies and with my simplistic 8-year-old mind, I thought that Bill Clinton's proposal sounded better. He's saying, let's increase the welfare state. Let's just give things to people that are less fortunate. I was like, well, that sounds like the nicer thing to do. So yeah, I'll go with that guy. Because 8-year-old Caleb didn't understand that we were living in a world with finite resources where someone has to pay for those things. See, that's generally the difference in a child and an adult. When you're an adult, you look at things more realistically. You understand that there are certain things. So the one thing that I think is incorrect in that tweet is that it's some kind of indoctrination. The idea that there, and I have people even in my own family that subscribe to this, that somehow the only reason people believe in capitalism is because they were brainwashed into it, which also doesn't make any sense, because how would we have ever got capitalism in the first place? If it takes some kind of giant media conspiracy to trick people into doing this, then how did the first capitalist ever come about? That doesn't make any sense. By the way, I don't believe that communism does that either. I think that there is a very strong, very well thought out process through the education system that has taken place over a number of years, where socialists have taken over pretty much every position in power in education, which is why I find it hilarious that he's saying that people have to be indoctrinated to be capitalist. I think you could make a far more compelling case, especially if you're looking at the current ground of common academic institutions. If you're looking at the groundwork that has been laid there, you would definitely have to say it leans more toward the socialist side. But the point is, it's maturity, not indoctrination, that winds up changing us. You see, as children, we're incredibly selfish. And it seems like the younger we are, the more selfish we are. Your 1-year-old baby doesn't care that you just worked a double shift. He's hungry. He's going to cry and keep you up. The thought never enters his head, okay, I've got to calm down because mom's had a rough day. Like, that's not a thing that he thinks about. And there's nothing wrong with that. He's a 1-year-old. That's what he's supposed to do. But what's funny is that they almost think that that's the mindset that we ought to keep throughout our entire lives. Little kids are very selfish. They don't think about other people. That's why you have to teach them to be considerate. That's why you have to teach them to share their toys. That's why you have to teach them to do virtually every good thing that they do, because as kids, they're only thinking about themselves. And that's exactly what a socialist would do. They think about things from their perspective. Well, if something happens that is unfortunate for me, I'd rather somebody else take care of me. And by the way, the interesting thing about this, and the same thing that happened to me when I was voting for Bill Clinton in our little mock election when I was a third grader, is that I was thinking about it from the perspective of, yeah, somebody else should take care of those people. That's exactly what a socialist thinks. That's why little kids, I think this guy is right, primarily are socialists. They're like, yeah, there are people that need things out there. Well, somebody else should go and take care of them. The little kid's not thinking of it from the perspective that I should go and take care of them, and that's exactly what your socialists tend to do. That's why people like AOC can say, no, you just pay for it. Well, how do you pay for it? No, you don't like actually earn the money and then decide what to do with it. You just pay for it. You just do it. That's the kind of thing that socialists are operating under. They live in a fantasy world where they think that when they give out things to people, those things don't cost somebody else. They really do believe in the concept of a free lunch, which is something only a child would believe in. And by the way, notice that liberals are kind of like children and think not only that other people should be giving things to them and other people should be providing for the people that are unfortunate and need help, but this is something that is really universal. Not only in the United States, but across other countries. We're going to look at the United States, of course, because that's where we are. But this is something that has been shown throughout all of human history. This has been done in studies in other countries, in the UK, in other European countries. When they look at political leanings, the younger you are, the more liberal you tend to be. Maturity, not indoctrination, generally causes people to become more conservative. So just to sort of back this up, we can look at a study that was done by the University of Chicago. This is the abstract of that study, where they say, if you look at the highlighted portion at the bottom, in contrast to previous research, however, we also find support for folk wisdom. On those occasions when political attitudes do shift across the lifespan, liberals are more likely to become conservatives than conservatives are to become liberals, suggesting that folk wisdom has some empirical basis, even as it overstates the degree of change. Now, this is a fair-handed analysis. It's saying that old saying that people used to say, and it's been attributed to 30 different people at this point. A really common one is Winston Churchill, who and he probably said this at some point, but we think he was probably drawing from somebody else, that if you are over 30, if you're under 30 and you're not a liberal, you have no heart, and if you're over 30 and not a conservative, you have no brain, something to that effect. That's been repeated by many, many different famous people. The reason that is the folk wisdom that is being talked about in that Chicago study, it actually does bear out. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person over 30 is a conservative and every single one under 30 is a liberal. That's simply not realistic. And that's what it means by overstating that in the folk wisdom. But what it is suggesting is, yeah, there's some truth to it. Typically, if you do make a change over time in your lifespan, you don't become more liberal as you get older, you become more conservative. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, that is the trend that we see. That was also backed up by a study that was done by Pew Research. So if we can bring that up, you'll see that this is where they broke down what they called political typologies, which, by the way, there's a lot of fascinating stuff in the study that they did, but we're going to look at it for the purposes of determining whether people age into becoming more conservative. What I want you to notice is you're looking at it broken up by age group. And you'll notice as you get older, your age groups tend to expand. And this is something that is true now, but it's been true for a long time. So you can't just say, well, that's how they are stagnantly. No, this has happened for a very long time. And what I really want you to zero in on, what I really want you to notice here, which I find fascinating, is you'll not only notice that the trending conservative groups, steadfast conservatives, business conservatives, and young outsiders, that they don't only expand, but they expand in certain very specific ways. And you'll notice that on the blue side, those categories tend to contract with the exception of one. Which one actually gets bigger? A typology that trends left. Faith and family left. Now, if you're looking at the comparison of younger versus older on the conservative-leaning typologies, you'll notice the ones that increase are steadfast conservatives, which are virtually nobody in the 18 to 29 age. I would have been one of the rare exceptions on that one. And business conservatives also expand. Young outsiders tend to decrease. Now, that makes sense because they actually have young in their name. So what does this suggest? This suggests that as you age, you are more likely to get involved in the business world and look at things from a mature standpoint. In other words, you're looking at it from a number standpoint and a pragmatic standpoint. Steadfast conservatives, that means you're an ideologic conservative. In other words, you understand the ideology of those in conservative positions, those in the right, and you tend to go into that one. And then another thing, the faith and family left, even though it's one that trends blue, it's the only segment of the left that actually expands, which would suggest what? There are three things that become more important to your political leanings as you age. Your ideology, in other words, understanding politics and how it works. You get involved in some kind of business, whether it's your job, whether you're a business owner. And then the third one would be faith. Well, that's pretty interesting because those are typically the reasons that people do become more conservative as they age out. Their business, their faith, and their understanding of the conservative ideal as a whole. Their understanding, their wisdom increases, and thus they become more conservative than they were in their youth. See, that's fascinating because it coincides directly with our synopsis, our thesis here, of what we're looking at, that it is indeed maturity, not some kind of indoctrination that causes younger people to be socialists. We're basically all born with a more communist socialist mindset and then age on to live in the real world and change our beliefs, understanding that many of our childish beliefs were not accurate or were not realistic. It does go back to a worldview issue. I think this whole thing goes back to a worldview issue, which is essentially, and I believe this wholeheartedly, that the vast majority of people on the left are on the left because they believe that people are generally good. I mean, think about this. We'll use an extreme example here to illustrate the point, but let's look at guns. The reason that they want to get rid of guns is because they believe that generally people are good, and if you tell people not to have guns, they won't have them. That's the only way any person could believe that telling a bad guy he's not allowed to have a gun, that he won't get a gun. It's an idealistic and childish way to look at the world. The reason that socialism always fails, I mean, how many times have you heard this from people on the left and the right? That socialism is perfect until you get people involved. Now, they'll claim that if you get the right people involved, it'll actually work this time, which is stupid on a number of levels. But the point is that they genuinely do believe that human nature is generally good, and if you just give equal things to people, that they'll all be equally virtuous. That the only reason there are bad people is because society somehow made them bad. Society somehow corrupted them. The system that we have is what corrupted them. The whole idea of America was based on the opposite idea. Basically, we assumed that people are awful and people can become corrupt, and their default is to be evil, and they must be educated and trained and become good, which, by the way, is the Christian worldview. That because people are generally evil and because it is so easy to corrupt them, that what we must do is we must make government as limited as humanly possible to prevent people from exercising that corruption in a way that harms another person. Doesn't work perfectly, and even with the limited amount of government power even our original government had, there were still abuses. It's by no means a perfect system. But the point is, one system basically assumes on everyone being altruistic and everybody, if you just give them all the same stuff, everybody has the equal amount of income, they have the same house, they have the same car, they'll all basically just be good and live in a utopia. The conservative, or in this case, the American idea, the way that our government was founded, it was upon the idea that people are generally bad. And because of that, nobody can be trusted with that level of influence and power. And humans can't make a perfect world because we're humans and we suck. That's basically the whole idea behind our government. Without going into too much detail, that's the reason why we have 3 branches of government in the United States. This is stated over and over again in the Federalist Papers and by the founders themselves. They believed that the only way to keep government power in check and to keep it from growing, granted it's grown a lot and way beyond the scope of what they ever imagined, but they believed the only way to keep government from growing is to separate the powers so that they would all jealously guard their own power. In other words, our system actually uses the jealousy of human beings against one another. It assumes that Congress is going to be jealous and won't want to relinquish its power to our judges or to our president. Therefore, they would want to keep all of their own power. And the same would be true of the president, and the same would be true of the Supreme Court. And because of that, they would all be jealously guarding their own power, a bad trait that actually keeps them from gaining power in the others. Because if the president tries to gain power, the Supreme Court or the Congress say, no, you can't do that. That's one of our powers. That's the stopgap that our founders put in place. That's the difference in worldview here. Generally speaking, the reason that most children are socialists, the reason that most children would lean socialist, and if you ask them a bunch of questions, they'd sound a lot more like AOC than they would Rand Paul, is because kids also naively believe that people are basically good, that people are basically trustworthy, and that the average person, even if you gave him the same amount of money, whether he did a lot of work or very little work, that he would work just as hard. That's a naive, childish way of looking at things. Adults understand you have to go out, you have to work, you have to do things, and you need some kind of motivation to do that, because we kind of figure that if we were getting paid the same for working or not working, we'd choose to not work. That's where the difference in worldview comes in. That's where the rubber meets the road. And ultimately, I do want to say this. Idealism isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if you use your idealism as a way to basically guard yourself from the truth, then it absolutely becomes a bad thing. I consider myself very idealistic. Part of my political philosophy is because I'm a very idealistic person. But ultimately, we do live in a practical world with real rules, real limitations, and people that generally aren't all that great to begin with. And so because of that, as we age and mature and we start understanding more about the world, we start making some kind of formulating ideas that tend to be more conservative. You see, the thing about liberals are they basically want to stay kids their whole life. That's why President Obama thinks that you should be able to stay on your parents' insurance until you're 26. That's just the way that liberals are. They have a Peter Pan complex. They want to live in a perpetual state of adolescence, and it's not good. That's the reason they want to go to college and then to graduate school and basically stay in their teenage years up until the point that they're in their mid to late 20s. Instead of getting out in the real world and actually being productive, they'd rather prolong that as much as possible. You see, liberals would rather cloak themselves in the mantle of ignorance and live in childish bliss than they would formulate ideas that work in the real world. That's the difference in the worldview of a conservative and a liberal, and that's why younger people tend to be more liberal and older people tend to be more conservative. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Samuel. We are continuing our study in Samuel. And really the only thing that you need to know to understand this story, because it's very self-explanatory, the big detail you need to know is that by this point, Samuel is getting a little up there. He's been ministering to Judah and to Israel for a long time now, and he's a very well-known prophet. He's kind of, this isn't like an official title or anything, but he's kind of seen as the head prophet of Israel. He's probably the most famous one, the most well-known one. And so he's been in his ministry for a really long time now, and people kind of see him almost in the same way as they did Moses. Like I said, Samuel's not the only prophet like Moses was when he was there, but he holds a similar level of prestige, and that's really where we start off in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. So let's go ahead and look at that right now. And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together, and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. In this little Bible story, and this is one of my favorite passages of Scripture because it just speaks so much to the human condition, and we're going to be spending a little bit more time in chapter 8 even after today. Did the children of Israel have a legitimate gripe? Oh yeah. I mean, here you have people that are supposed to be judges, God's representatives to discern judgment between his people on Israel. They are literally representing God. And they're taking bribes and doing all kinds of ill-gotten things. That basically you can buy God's favor. That's the message that Samuel's sons are sending out, and God is not happy with it. So it is absolutely understandable that Israel is very upset with this. There is no way that you can look at that in a positive light. However, here's the follow-up question that a lot of people maybe don't ask about this. Did their solution make any sense? Actually, no. Because, and it's hilarious that this just happened to coincide with our previous segment where I was talking about a difference in worldviews. You see, their solution didn't match their problem. Their problem was there's corrupt people that are corrupting God's system, the system that he put together of judges in Israel, and so we want to get rid of the judges' system and we want a king. Now think about this. Their problem is there was a human being that was judging the people that was corruptible. And because they were corruptible, then they said that the system obviously isn't broken. You can't look at a misuse of the system and blame the system itself. Now, if there is some kind of inherent flaw in the system that leads to this or makes it more prone to this, okay, that's a fair argument. But what they're doing here is not that. What they're doing here is saying, okay, there are some corrupt judges here, and it's not working in this particular instance, so we want to do away with it, and we want to have a king. Now, think about this. Judges did have a level of power and influence over Israel. I mean, that's how the system works. They had to have at least somebody that had authority over the people to say, nope, this is right and this is wrong. They had to have some sort of law enforcement in the land, which is why the judges were put there in the first place. But what's going on here is they're saying, these people are corrupt and they have a lot of influence over us. Give us somebody with absolute authority over us. What? So you're saying because people can be corrupted and these two judges are corrupted, now you want me to give you somebody that has absolute authority to tell you to do whatever you want? I mean, literally anything they can tell you to do, you have to comply with? That doesn't make any sense. Because what's to stop a corrupt person from becoming king? And by the way, if you look at Israel's history, that was the norm, not the exception. There's only like maybe half a dozen good kings in the entire Bible. Out of the several dozen, you've got maybe 6 or 7 really good kings, and that's it. And even the good kings, they still had some pretty significant problems with their own corruption too. And so it's just fascinating to look at this, that their solution to a problem is to put themselves in a position where that problem can be made far, far worse. And their solution doesn't make any sense. So the point of all that is, corrupt people abusing a system is not a repudiation on the system itself. And what they were doing was rejecting God. They were rejecting God's plan. They were rejecting his recommendations for them. And we're actually going to see this a little bit later. They didn't want God to be their king. They didn't want God to be their king. They wanted a human being in that position, which is wrong on a number of levels. Sure, yeah, people screw up who were supposed to be representatives of God all the time. This story is a case study in that. But ultimately, there's a difference in having a human being with limited power and a human being with absolute power. Because if he has absolute power, then a corrupt person will do a lot more damage. That's the reason that the judges system was in place. And the thing is, I don't think that it's even possible, because I've done stories on this particular passage of scripture countless times. And yet, reading it today, I don't think that it's possible to think of a more appropriate Bible story than right now, with what we're seeing going on with this virus. There are so many people that are scared and panicked, and they have legitimate gripes. They have legitimate fears. There are things that are going on that are wrong. But their solution doesn't make any sense. Their solution is to empower the same corruptible government, the same corruptible people that put them in those bad positions in the first place, and give them even more authority than they had beforehand. It just doesn't make any sense. But it shows how dangerous being in a crowd of people can be. It shows how dangerous groupthink can be. That because a whole bunch of people want it, we feel secure in the herd, and if a bunch of people agree with us, then, well, I mean, how could we be wrong? Look at the way that this reads, that the entirety of Israel, it almost seems, first of all, it says the elders specifically, but the wisest, all of the people of Israel, seemingly the vast, vast majority of them, at least is implied, wanted a king and wanted to get rid of the prophets and get rid of the judges system. Because they had corrupt judges, so now they want to judge with even more power than they had before. None of that makes sense, but because there were a lot of people that agreed with them, that's what they went with. This is something that is a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament, that the people of Israel ask for something, And they keep asking for it, and they keep asking for it, and they keep asking for it, either directly through asking or through their actions. And then eventually, no matter how bad an idea it is, eventually God says, all right, if that's what you want, have at it. And it never ends well for them. Just because a whole bunch of people agree with it doesn't mean it's a good idea. And the way that I've seen people here recently willing to just hand over their freedom as a blank check for people in authority to do whatever they want to with it, even though the very thing that they're complaining about were things that essentially they're put in that position by the same government. They're saying, no, please take my liberties away and do whatever you want to with them. I mean, that's exactly what happened in Israel. They were panicked. They were in a legitimately bad situation. And because of that, they put forth a solution that actually made their situation much worse. And that's really what we see happen with them. You see, when something's not working, change is a good thing. But difference for the sake of difference is never wise. If you come up with a solution that is different than the current system that's going on now, and it actually is better, then great. I'm all for it. Full steam ahead. But if you see some kind of problem and your solution is, well, let's just do something different, not let's do something that will work better, let's just do something different, that's not a good excuse for changing the system you're under. And unfortunately, for the next several hundred years of biblical history, Israel got a very realistic metaphor on that. They lived out the consequences of their bad decisions that they made while they were in a panic. I hope that's a lesson for us today. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media, Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.